He pulled them from the jaws of death in a river crawling with gators. A desperate old man and his terrified granddaughter clinging to wreckage in water that boiled with ancient hunger. And Tobias Hawke never asked their names or where they came from. Because out here on the wild edge of Texas territory, you saved a life first and asked questions later. But when the men in fine suits came riding 3 weeks later with deeds and documents, he learned the bitter truth, that the two strangers he'd sheltered in his one-room shack were Augustus and Stella Vale. And they didn't just own land in this territory, they owned half of it. Thousands upon thousands of acres that stretched from the Brazos River to the Caprock. And suddenly, the lonely hunter who'd wanted nothing but solitude found himself caught between gratitude and pride. Between the life he'd built in isolation and the family he never knew he needed. The sun hung low and mean over the bitter river, turning the water to molten copper. Tobias Hawke moved through the cottonwoods with the silence of smoke, his rifle cradled easy in the crook of his arm, moccasins finding purchase on ground that would betray a white man's boot. He was tracking deer, a big buck he'd been following for 2 days. And the signs were fresh, the earth still damp where the animal had knelt to drink. August in this part of Texas was a living thing, thick and hostile. The kind of heat that made a man's thoughts slow and dangerous. Tobias didn't mind. He'd been alone out here for 4 years, ever since he'd left the Choctaw settlement north of the Red River, left behind the politics and the missionaries and the slow death of tradition. Out here a man could live by older laws, the kind written in animal tracks and weather signs, the kind that didn't care about your blood or your past. He was 40 paces from the river when he heard it. A sound that didn't belong, a child's scream, high and sharp enough to scatter the crows from the willows. Tobias froze, every instinct suddenly alert. Children didn't come this far into the wild country, not unless something had gone very wrong. The scream came again, ragged with terror, and beneath it another sound, the thrashing of something large in the water. Tobias ran. He broke through the tree line, and the scene hit him like a fist to the chest. 50 yards downstream, a covered wagon had overturned in the shallows, its canvas torn and dragging in the current, supplies scattered across the muddy bank like a merchant's nightmare. But that wasn't what stopped his breath. In the deeper water, clinging to a half-submerged trunk, was an old man, white-haired and soaked through, and beside him a little girl, maybe 8 years old. Her dress tangled in the debris, and circling them, dark shapes moving with terrible purpose, were gators. Tobias counted 4 of the beasts, each one bigger than a man, their ridged backs breaking the surface like ancient stones. The nearest was closing on the girl, its eyes cold and patient above the waterline. The old man was trying to shield her with his body, but he was weak, his grip on the log failing. There was no time for thought, only action. Tobias raised his rifle, sighted down the barrel, let his breath out slow the way his grandfather had taught him. The first shot cracked across the water like thunder. The lead gator jerked, thrashed, its tail whipping the river into foam. Not a killing shot, but enough to hurt, enough to make it reconsider. The other gators scattered, disappearing beneath the brown water, but Tobias knew they wouldn't go far. Gators were patient. Gators could wait. He stripped off his rifle belt and plunged into the river. The water was bathwater warm and thick with silt. Tobias moved fast, powerful strokes that ate the distance, his eyes never leaving the old man and the girl. Up close, he could see the terror in their faces, the exhaustion. The old man's lips were moving, maybe prayer, maybe just sounds, and the girl was sobbing. Her small hands locked around the log with desperate strength. "I've got you," Tobias said, his voice low and certain. "Let go of the wood. I'll get you to shore." The old man's eyes found his, pale blue and sharp despite the fear. "The child first," he managed, his voice cultured Eastern, completely out of place in this wild water. "Please, save Stella first," Tobias didn't argue. He pulled the girl free from the debris, felt her arms lock around his neck with the grip of drowning. She was small, light as a bird, but terror made her strong. He kept one arm around her and used the other to stroke toward the bank, his legs kicking hard beneath the surface. Behind him, he heard the old man struggling to follow, heard the labored breathing. Something brushed Tobias's leg, scales rough as tree bark. His blood went cold. The gators were coming back, drawn by the movement, by the scent of fear in the water. He kicked harder, felt the river bottom rising beneath his feet, and then he was stumbling onto the muddy bank, the girl still clinging to him like she'd never let go. He set her down and turned back. The old man was 20 feet out, floundering, his strength nearly gone. And behind him, cutting through the water with terrible speed, was the biggest gator Tobias had ever seen, 14 feet if it was an inch, its mouth opening to show rows of teeth like railroad spikes. Tobias grabbed his rifle from where he'd dropped it, worked the lever, aimed. The gator was too close to the old man, the angle all wrong. If he missed, if the bullet went through, he'd kill them both. His hands were steady. They'd always been steady. He fired. The shot took the gator in the eye, punched through to whatever passed for a brain in that ancient skull. The beast rolled, its death throes churning the water red, and Tobias was already moving, splashing back into the river, catching the old man as he went under. He hauled him up, got an arm around his chest, dragged him toward shore with strength born of pure, stubborn will. They collapsed together on the bank, all three of them, gasping and shaking. The girl crawled to the old man, pressed herself against his side, and he wrapped his arms around her, his whole body trembling. Tobias lay on his back in the mud, staring at the sky, his heart hammering against his ribs like it wanted out. For a long moment, nobody spoke. There was only the sound of the river, indifferent and eternal, and the ragged breathing of people who just looked death in its reptilian eye and somehow lived to tell about it. Tobias sat up slowly, checked himself for injuries. Nothing but scratches. He looked at his two unexpected companions, really looked at them for the first time. The old man was 70 if he was a day, but there was quality in his bearing, in the cut of his ruined clothes. His shirt had been fine linen once, his boots custom leather now caked with river mud. His face was lined but aristocratic, the kind of face you saw in oil paintings, not on the frontier. And the girl, she had the same refined features, the same pale skin that spoke of bloodlines and breeding, her dark hair plastered to her head, her dress torn but clearly expensive before the river had its way with it. "You're a long way from anywhere," Tobias said finally, his voice rough. "What happened?" The old man coughed, spat river water. When he spoke, his accent confirmed what Tobias had suspected: Boston or Philadelphia, old money and older names. "Our driver," he managed, "took our money and supplies 3 miles back, left us the wagon and bad directions. We tried to ford the river at what he said was a shallow crossing." He coughed again, and Tobias saw blood fleck his lips. "Grandpa," the girl whispered, her voice small and terrified. "Grandpa, please don't die. Hush now, Stella," the old man said, stroking her wet hair with a shaking hand. "I'm not going anywhere. This good man has seen to that." He turned those sharp blue eyes on Tobias. "We owe you our lives, Mr. Hawk," Tobias said. "Tobias Hawk, and you don't owe me anything. Out here you help people. That's the law." "Nevertheless," the old man said, and even half-drowned and bleeding, there was authority in his voice, the voice of someone used to being heard. "We are in your debt. I'm Augustus Vale, and this is my granddaughter, Stella Vale." The name meant nothing to Tobias, but he nodded politely, already thinking ahead. The sun was dropping fast, and night in this country was no friend to the unprepared. The wagon was destroyed, their supplies gone, and the old man was hurt worse than he was letting on. Tobias could see it in the way he held himself, in the tightness around his eyes. "Can you walk?" Tobias asked. Augustus tried to stand, made it halfway before his legs gave out. Tobias caught him before he fell, felt the old man's weight, felt how little of it there was. "I seem to be," Augustus paused, pride warring with reality, "somewhat compromised. My cabin's 2 miles north," Tobias said, making the decision without debate. "It's not much, but it's dry and it's got a stove. You can rest there until you're strong enough to move on." He looked at Stella. "Can you walk, little one?" The girl nodded, her eyes huge in her pale face. She hadn't let go of her grandfather's hand, and Tobias saw the fierce protectiveness in her grip, saw the way she positioned herself between Augustus and the world. This was a child who'd learned too young that the world could take things from you. Tobias fashioned a rough travois from branches and rope, salvaged from the wagon wreckage. Got Augustus settled on it as comfortably as possible. The old man bore it with stoic grace, but Tobias saw the pain in every line of his body. They needed to move before full dark, before the predators came out, the four-legged kind and the two-legged kind that were sometimes worse. "Stay close," Tobias told Stella, and began the long pull north through the gathering dusk. The journey was hard. The travois caught on roots and rocks, and Augustus bit back groans with every jolt. Stella walked beside her grandfather, one small hand resting on his chest, as if her touch alone could keep him tethered to the world. Tobias moved with steady purpose, reading the land in the failing light, choosing the smoothest path through rough country. By the time they reached the cabin, full night had fallen, and the stars were coming out like cold fire. Tobias's home was a simple structure, logs chinked with mud, a stone chimney, a single room that served for everything. It wasn't much, but it was solid, built with his own hands to last through the hard seasons. He'd chosen this spot for the spring that bubbled up 30 paces from the door, for the defensive sight lines, for the sense of being at the edge of the world where a man could breathe. He got Augustus inside, onto the narrow bed that was the cabin's only real furniture. Stella hovered anxiously as Tobias built up the fire, set water to heat, began the practical work of keeping people alive. He'd done this before, in the settlement, when hunters came back torn up by bears or snake-bit, or simply broken by the land's casual cruelty. His hands knew what to do. Augustus had bruised ribs, maybe cracked, and a gash on his leg that needed cleaning and stitching. Tobias worked with quiet efficiency, his needle and thread closing the wound, while Augustus gripped the bed frame and made no sound. Stella watched it all with solemn eyes, and when Tobias offered her a cup of water, she drank without question, trusting him in the way children sometimes do when the world has run out of options. "You'll both need dry clothes," Tobias said when the immediate work was done. "I've got spare shirts that'll work as nightshirts for now. Your things from the wagon, gone," Augustus said quietly. "Everything. Our clothes, our money, our papers, all of it lost to the river or stolen by that thieving driver." He closed his eyes. "We have nothing, Mr. Hawke. We are utterly dependent on your charity." "It's not charity," Tobias said, the words coming out harder than he meant. "It's just what you do. You help people." He pulled 2 clean shirts from his trunk, handed one to Stella. "You can change behind that curtain, little one. Your grandfather and I will turn our backs when they were all sorted." Stella in a shirt that hung to her ankles like a dress. Augustus in clothes that emphasized how thin he'd become. Tobias heated the stew he'd made 2 days before, venison and wild onions and prairie turnips. It wasn't fancy, but it was hot and filling, and he watched his unexpected guests eat with the focused intensity of people who'd forgotten their last meal. Stella fell asleep almost immediately after eating, curled on Tobias's bedroll by the fire, exhaustion finally claiming her. Augustus watched her with an expression of such fierce love and terror that Tobias had to look away. He knew that look. He'd seen it on his sister's face years ago, before the fever took her children. "She's all I have left," Augustus said softly, as if reading Tobias's thoughts. "Her parents, my son and his wife, died of cholera in St. Louis last winter. I was raising her in Boston, but the doctors said I needed a warmer, drier climate for my lungs." He coughed, as if to prove the point. "We were traveling to San Antonio, where I'd purchased property, where we were going to start over, long way from Boston to San Antonio," Tobias observed. "Pouring coffee, the real kind he saved for occasions." "Yes," Augustus accepted the cup with shaking hands. "A very long way, and I fear I've made a terrible mistake, bringing her out here, putting her in danger." His voice broke. "When that gator came for her, when I thought—" "Don't," Tobias said quietly. "Don't go down that road. She's safe. You're both safe. That's what matters." Augustus looked at him, really looked at him, taking in the long black hair tied back with leather, the copper skin, the features that marked Tobias as clearly as any paper document. "You're Choctaw," he said, not a question. "My mother was full blood," Tobias confirmed. "My father was a Scottish trader. I grew up in both worlds, never quite fitting in either." He sipped his coffee. "Eventually I stopped trying to fit. Came out here where a man is judged by what he does, not what he is. A sensible philosophy," Augustus said. "And a lonely one, I suspect." Tobias said nothing, because it was true, and there was no point denying it. He'd chosen this isolation, built it deliberately like a wall between himself and a world that had disappointed him too many times. Out here, he answered to no one, depended on no one, and was disappointed by no one. "It was a hard life, but it was honest. How long do you think before I can travel?" Augustus asked, changing the subject with the tact of a gentleman. Tobias considered. "Week, maybe 2. Your ribs need time to heal, and that leg wound could turn bad if you push it. The nearest town with a doctor is Presidio, 4 days' ride south. You're not making that journey anytime soon. Then we are imposing on your hospitality for some time," Augustus said. And there was apology in his voice, but also resignation, the acceptance of a man who'd run out of choices. "I wish I could offer you payment, but I don't want payment," Tobias said, the words coming out sharp. "I've got food enough for 3 if we're careful, and the hunting's been good. You'll stay until you're healed. Then you can go on your way." Augustus nodded slowly, his eyes searching Tobias's face. "You're a good man, Mr. Hawke, better than we had any right to hope for." Tobias stood abruptly, uncomfortable with the gratitude, with the weight of expectation in the old man's voice. "I'll take the first watch," he said. "Sleep if you can. Tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next." But as he stepped outside into the cool night air, his rifle in hand, he couldn't shake the feeling that tomorrow had already arrived. That the moment he'd pulled them from the river, he'd set something in motion that couldn't be stopped. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent and eternal, and somewhere in the darkness a coyote called, lonely and wild. Tobias stood guard through the long night, watching over 2 strangers who'd stumbled into his carefully constructed solitude, and wondered what price he'd pay for his moment of heroism. Inside the cabin, Augustus Vale lay awake, staring at the rough-hewn ceiling, his granddaughter sleeping peacefully nearby, and thought about the man who'd saved them. There was more to Tobias Hawke than he showed, more depth behind those careful eyes, and Augustus found himself curious, despite his exhaustion. Who chose to live this far from civilization? What drove a man to such complete isolation? And more importantly, what would it take to convince him that some things, some people were worth breaking that isolation for, but those were questions for tomorrow or the day after, or however long it took for his body to remember how to work properly. For now, there was only the warmth of the fire, the sound of Stella's peaceful breathing, and the knowledge that against all odds they were still alive. The first grey light of dawn found Tobias already awake, crouched by the spring with his hands submerged in cold water, washing the previous day's blood and river mud from his skin. He hadn't slept, hadn't even tried. Sleep was a luxury for men who didn't have questions churning in their minds like mill wheels. He kept replaying the moment he'd heard that scream, the split second where he could have chosen differently, could have convinced himself it was just an animal sound carried strange by the wind, could have turned back to his deer trail and his solitary life. But he hadn't, and now 2 strangers breathed the air in his cabin, occupied his space, disrupted the careful balance he'd spent 4 years constructing. Tobias stood, shook the water from his hands, and tried to identify the emotion sitting heavy in his chest. It wasn't resentment exactly, though there was some of that. It was something more complicated, something that felt dangerously close to purpose. Inside, he found Stella awake, sitting up in the bedroll with her knees pulled to her chest, watching the dying embers of the fire with the solemn expression of a much older person. She didn't startle when Tobias entered, just turned those dark eyes on him with a gravity that made him uncomfortable. "Morning," he said quietly, not wanting to wake Augustus, who was snoring softly on the bed. The first real sleep he'd probably had in days. "Is Grandpa going to die?" Stella asked, her voice small but direct. No child's dancing around the hard question. Tobias moved to the stove, began building up the fire from last night's coals, buying himself a moment to choose his words. "No," he said finally, meaning it. "He's hurt and he's tired, but he's not dying. I've seen dying men, little one. Your grandfather's got plenty of fight left in him." "Mama and Papa had fight too," Stella said, and there was something terrible in her voice. The flat certainty of a child who'd learned that fight wasn't always enough. The doctors said they were strong, but they died anyway. Tobias set down the kindling, turned to face her fully. She deserved that much, deserved to be taken seriously. "Your mama and papa got sick with something that kills strong and weak alike, something that doesn't care how much fight you've got. Your grandpa's just banged up from a river crossing gone wrong. That's different. That heals. Promise." The word came out desperate, all the composure cracking to show the terrified 8-year-old underneath. Tobias didn't make promises lightly. He'd learned young that a man's word was all he had, that breaking it diminished you in ways that couldn't be repaired. But he looked at this child who'd lost so much already, who was trying so hard to be brave, and he found himself nodding. "I promise. I won't let anything happen to him, or to you." The relief that washed over Stella's face was almost painful to witness. She didn't cry, didn't throw herself at him the way some children might. She just nodded, accepting his word the way she might accept a signed contract. And Tobias felt the weight of that trust settle on his shoulders like a physical thing. He got the fire going properly, set coffee to boil, began mixing cornmeal and water for johnny cakes. Simple food, but it would fill bellies and give strength. As he worked, Stella watched him with focused attention, memorizing his movements, and when he gestured for her to come help, she moved with careful precision, her small hands mimicking his technique for flipping the cakes on the hot stone. "You're a quick learner," Tobias observed, and was rewarded with a shy smile, the first real expression of childhood he'd seen from her. "Mama used to say I watched everything too close," Stella said, "concentrating on not burning the johnny cake. Said I saw things other people missed. That's a gift out here," Tobias told her. "People who don't pay attention don't last long. The land teaches you, but only if you're willing to learn." They worked in companionable silence after that, and Tobias found himself appreciating the lack of chatter, the way Stella seemed content to exist without filling every moment with noise. By the time Augustus stirred, they had breakfast ready, coffee steaming, the cabin filled with warmth and the smell of cooking. "Good morning," Augustus said, his voice stronger than the night before, though Tobias could hear the pain underneath. The old man tried to sit up, couldn't quite manage it, and Tobias was there with a supporting arm before he could struggle. "Easy," Tobias said. "Those ribs are going to hurt for a while. Best to move slow." They ate together, the three of them, and there was something almost ceremonial about it, the sharing of food in a place where food was earned hard. Augustus ate with better appetite than the night before, asking Stella questions about how she'd helped with breakfast, praising her effort in a way that made the child glow. Tobias watched the interaction with something that might have been envy, thinking about the family he'd left behind, the nieces and nephews he hadn't seen in years. After breakfast, while Stella cleaned the dishes with water from the bucket, Augustus caught Tobias's eye. "Might we speak privately, Mr. Hawke?" Tobias nodded, helped Augustus outside to the rough bench he'd built beside the cabin door, where a man could sit and watch the land stretch away to forever. The morning was already heating up, promising another scorcher, and the cicadas were starting their industrial chorus in the cottonwoods. "I've been thinking," Augustus began, settling himself carefully on the bench, "about our situation. We have no money, no supplies, no means of transportation. Even when I'm healed, we're weeks from San Antonio, and the journey is clearly more dangerous than I anticipated." He paused, choosing his words. "I wonder if I might impose upon you further. You want me to guide you to San Antonio," Tobias said, already seeing where this was headed. "Not just guide," Augustus said. "I'd like to hire you properly. though I confess I can't pay you until we reach our destination. I have accounts there, resources. Once we arrive, I can compensate you generously for your time and trouble." Tobias was already shaking his head before Augustus finished. "I don't hire out as a guide. I don't leave this place. This is my home. Mr. Hawke, please." Augustus's voice took on an edge of desperation. "I'm an old man with a child to protect. I've already proven spectacularly incompetent at navigating this territory. Without help, I'm not certain we'll survive the journey. There are professional guides in Presidio," Tobias said, his voice firm. "Men who know the roads, who have wagons and supplies. Once you're healed enough to travel, I'll take you there, get you set up with someone reliable, and if something happens on the way to Presidio..." Augustus pressed. 4 days through hostile country, you said. What if we encounter more thieves, or hostile natives, or any number of dangers I'm not equipped to handle? "You'll have me with you to Presidio," Tobias countered. "After that, you'll be fine." Augustus studied him with those sharp blue eyes, seeing more than Tobias wanted to show. "You're afraid," he said quietly. "Not of the journey, not of the danger. You're afraid of connection, of obligation, of stepping outside whatever boundary you've drawn around yourself." The words hit harder than they should have, partly because they were true. Tobias stood abruptly, putting distance between himself and the old man's uncomfortable perception. "I've got work to do," he said. "Traps to check, hunting to do if we're going to eat Mr. Hawke." But Tobias was already walking away, disappearing into the tree line with the silence that was his birthright. Behind him, Augustus sighed, a sound of frustration and resignation, and turned his face toward the morning sun. Tobias ran his trapline with more force than necessary, pulling each snare with sharp movements, checking his deadfalls with barely controlled irritation. Who was Augustus Vale to read him like a broadsheet? To identify fears Tobias barely acknowledged to himself. The old man was right, of course, which made it worse. Tobias had drawn boundaries, built walls, constructed a life where nothing could touch him because nothing could reach him. He'd learned the lesson early, watching his mother die slowly from the white man's diseases, watching his father drink himself into a grave, trying to forget her. He'd learned it again in the settlement, where half-blood children grew up belonging nowhere, too Indian for the whites, too white for the Indians. He'd learned it a final time with Mary Longfeather, who'd promised to wait for him while he went trapping one winter, and had married his cousin before the snow melted. After that, Tobias had stopped trying. He'd taken his skills, his rifle, and his wounded pride, and he'd walked away from every connection, every obligation, every possibility of disappointment. And it had worked. For 4 years it had worked perfectly. He'd been alone, but he'd been safe. Now 2 strangers had appeared in his carefully ordered world, and everything felt unstable, like the ground before an earthquake. Worse, he found himself caring despite his best efforts. He cared whether Augustus healed properly. He cared whether Stella had nightmares. He cared in a way that was already starting to hurt, because caring always led to loss. His last trap held a rabbit, fat and perfect. Tobias dispatched it quickly, cleanly, added it to his gathering bag. Fresh meat tonight, something to build strength. He was already thinking about how to prepare it, whether Stella would eat rabbit stew, whether Augustus could handle solid food. See, this was the problem. He was thinking about them, planning around them, adjusting his life to accommodate their presence. And when they left, because they would leave, what then? Back to the silence, but now he'd know what it sounded like with voices in it. Back to solitude, but now he'd remember what it felt like to be needed. Tobias made his way back to the cabin by a different route, checking his markers, reading the land for any sign of trouble. This was still dangerous country, despite what some folks in the settlements thought. Comanche raided through here. Bandits used the river crossing to ambush travelers, and wild animals killed careless people with depressing regularity. He needed to stay alert, needed to remember that he had dependents now, at least temporarily. When he emerged from the trees, he found Stella sitting on the bench where Augustus had been, the old man having moved back inside to rest. The girl had a stick in her hand and was drawing patterns in the dirt with intense concentration, her face scrunched up with effort. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What are you working on there? Tobias asked, approaching slowly so as not to startle her. Stella looked up, and there was something like pride in her expression. I'm drawing a map, she said, of everywhere we've been. Grandpa says a lady should always know where she is. Tobias crouched down to examine her work and felt surprise flicker through him. The map was crude but accurate, showing the river, the spot where their wagon had overturned, the path to the cabin. She'd even marked the spring, though she'd only seen it once. This is good work, he said, meaning it. You've got an eye for geography. Papa was a surveyor before he became a banker, Stella said, adding another line to represent the tree line. He used to take me on his jobs sometimes, taught me how to read landscapes, how to estimate distances, a voice caught. He said every vale should understand property. Vale. There was that name again, spoken with a casual assumption that Tobias should recognize it. He didn't press, just watched as Stella continued her map, her small hand steady despite everything she'd been through. Are you angry at us? She asked suddenly, not looking up from her drawing. The question caught Tobias off guard. No, why would I be angry? Grandpa says you want us to leave, that we're disrupting your life. Now she did look up, those dark eyes direct and serious. Are we a burden? Tobias sat down beside her on the bench, trying to figure out how to be honest without being cruel. You're not a burden, he said carefully, but I'm used to being alone. Having people here, it's different. It takes some adjusting. We could help, Stella offered quickly. I can cook and clean and I'm very quiet. Mama always said I was too quiet, actually. And Grandpa knows lots of things, important things. We could earn our keep. The eagerness in her voice, the desperate need to be useful, to be wanted, hit Tobias square in the chest. This was a child who'd lost her parents, been uprooted from everything familiar, nearly drowned in a gator-infested river, and was now trying to convince a stranger that she deserved to exist in his space. Stella, he said gently, you don't have to earn anything. You're here because you needed help, and out here that's enough. You understand? She nodded, but he could see she didn't quite believe it, that some part of her was still waiting for the moment when she'd prove insufficient and be cast out. It was a look he recognized from his own childhood, from every half-blood kid who'd learned too early that belonging was conditional. Tell you what, Tobias said, making a decision. How about I teach you some tracking skills? Might be useful to know, especially if you're going to be living in San Antonio. It's still frontier country down there. The transformation in Stella's face was immediate, suspicion giving way to surprised delight. Really, you'd teach me, if your grandfather doesn't mind, Tobias said. And if you promise to pay attention and follow instructions exactly, the wilderness doesn't forgive mistakes, I promise, Stella said solemnly. And Tobias could tell she meant it with every fiber of her small being. They spent the next hour in the clearing around the cabin, Tobias pointing out animal tracks, showing Stella how to read the stories written in disturbed earth and broken branches. She was a natural student, quick to understand, asking intelligent questions that showed she was actually thinking about what he told her. When he showed her how to identify deer tracks versus elk, she crouched down and traced the prints with her finger, committing the shape to memory. The deer is more delicate, she said, studying the impression. The toes are closer together. Exactly right, Tobias confirmed. You see how the elk's track is rounder, deeper. That's because they're bigger, heavier. Weight tells a story too. They were examining a coyote trail when Augustus appeared in the doorway, moving slowly but under his own power. He watched them with an expression Tobias couldn't quite read, something between gratitude and sorrow. I see Stella has found a willing teacher, Augustus said. His voice warmed despite the pain that still shadowed his face. She's a natural, Tobias replied, straightening up. Got the right temperament for it, patient and observant. She gets that from her father, Augustus said softly. Edward could spend hours studying a single property boundary, making sure every detail was correct. He paused. Thank you, Mr. Hawke, for this. For all of it. Tobias felt that familiar discomfort rising again, the urge to deflect, to minimize. But Stella was watching him with those serious eyes, and something made him nod, instead of brushing off the gratitude. You're welcome, he said simply. That afternoon, while Augustus rested and Stella practiced identifying tracks around the cabin, Tobias prepared the rabbit he'd caught. He worked the familiar motions, skinning and cleaning the animal with efficiency born of long practice, thinking about the strange turns life took. 3 days ago, he'd been a solitary hunter with nothing but his own survival to concern him. Now he was responsible for an injured old man and a child who looked at him like he held answers to questions she hadn't learned to ask yet. He was starting the stew when he heard horses, multiple animals moving fast through the trees. Tobias's hand went to his rifle instantly, years of frontier living turning wariness into reflex. He caught Stella's eye, gestured for her to get inside with her grandfather now. The girl moved without question, understanding the urgency even if she didn't know the cause. 3 riders broke through the tree line, pulling up short when they saw Tobias standing in front of his cabin, rifle held casual but ready. They were hard men, the kind who made their living in the grey spaces between law and outright banditry. The leader was thick-shouldered and cruel-faced, with a revolver worn low on his hip and the confident posture of someone used to getting his way. "Well now," the man said, his voice carrying false friendliness. "We're looking for some folks, an old man and a little girl. Heard there was a wagon wreck downriver a few days back. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" Tobias kept his expression neutral, his body language unconcerned. "Lots of wrecks on that river. Dangerous crossing. This particular old man," the leader continued, "he'd be worth a fair bit of money to certain parties. Substantial reward for information leading to his whereabouts." His eyes moved past Tobias to the cabin, calculating. "You living out here all alone, friend?" "I am," Tobias said, his voice flat and final. "And I haven't seen any old men or children. Just me and the land way I like it." The 3 riders exchanged glances, silent communication passing between them. The leader's hand drifted toward his revolver, not threatening yet, but getting there. "Mind if we look around? Just to be sure." "I do mind," Tobias said, and now there was steel in his voice, the tone of a man who'd drawn a line and would enforce it. "This is my land. You've asked your question, I've given my answer. Time for you to move on." For a long moment, tension hung thick as the summer heat. The leader was weighing odds, calculating whether whatever reward they were chasing was worth tangling with a man who clearly knew how to use the rifle he was holding. "Finally, wisdom or cowardice won out. No offense meant," the leader said, reining his horse around. "We'll just keep looking downriver." He touched his hat brim in mock courtesy. "You have a good day now." They rode off, but not far, Tobias suspected. He watched until they disappeared into the cottonwoods, then waited another full minute before lowering his rifle. When he turned back to the cabin, he found Augustus in the doorway, his face grave. "They're looking for us," the old man said quietly. "The men our driver must have sold information to. I'd hoped—" He shook his head. "I'd hoped we'd have more time." Tobias felt something cold settle in his gut. This wasn't just a matter of sheltering travelers anymore. This was trouble, the kind that could follow a man, that could turn a peaceful cabin into a battlefield. And yet, looking at Augustus's worried face, at Stella peeking out from behind her grandfather with frightened eyes, Tobias found he couldn't regret his lie to the riders. "How much time do you need?" Tobias asked, already knowing the answer would complicate everything. "A week at minimum before I can ride," Augustus said. "Perhaps 2 to be safe." Tobias nodded slowly, thinking through the implications. Those men would be back, if not tonight, then soon. They'd search the area, ask questions at any nearby settlement, piece together the truth eventually. Which meant Tobias had a choice to make: stand his ground and defend his unexpected guests, or convince them to leave before the situation turned bloody. He looked at Stella, at the trust in her eyes. at the way she'd taken his promise that morning as unbreakable law. He thought about Augustus's gratitude, about the way the old man had seen through his defenses to the fear underneath. He thought about his carefully constructed solitude, his 4 years of safety through isolation, and he made his choice. "Nobody's taking you," Tobias said, his voice quiet but absolute. "Not from my land. Not while I'm breathing." Augustus's eyes widened. "Mr. Hawke, I can't ask you to—" "You're not asking," Tobias interrupted. "I'm telling you. You're under my protection now, both of you. That means something out here. It means I'll stand between you and whatever's coming." He met Augustus's gaze steadily. "Even if what's coming is trouble I'd normally run from for a moment." The old man seemed unable to speak, emotion working in his refined features. When he finally found words, his voice was thick. "Why? Why would you risk yourself for strangers?" Tobias looked at Stella again, at this child who'd already lost so much, who was trying so hard to be brave. He thought about his own loneliness, about the sound of voices in his cabin, about the way it felt to be needed again. "Because," he said simply, "sometimes the right thing and the safe thing aren't the same. And I'd rather live right than safe." The sun was starting its long slide toward evening, painting the clearing in shades of amber and gold. Tobias stood in his doorway, rifle in hand, watching the tree line for movement, and wondered what price he'd just agreed to pay. Behind him, he could hear Stella asking her grandfather what was happening, could hear Augustus's calm reassurance that everything would be fine. Tobias hoped the old man was right, but he'd lived too long in wild country to count on hope. Hope didn't stop bullets or turn away determined men. Only vigilance did that. Vigilance and the willingness to do what needed doing when the moment came. And judging by the tracks those riders had left, the moment was coming soon. This attack came 3 nights later, in that deepest part of darkness, when even the nocturnal creatures fell silent and the world held its breath. Tobias had been expecting it, had barely slept since the riders' visit, keeping watch in rotating shifts that left him hollow-eyed but alert. He'd moved Augustus and Stella to sleep in the root cellar he'd dug beneath the cabin floor, a cramped space meant for storing vegetables, but now serving as a makeshift bunker. The old man had protested at first, pride warring with pragmatism, but Stella's safety had won the argument. Tobias was sitting by the window, rifle across his knees, when he caught the first sign of movement in the tree line. Not the riders from before. These were different men, more of them, at least 6 that he could count in the starlight. They moved with military precision, spreading out to surround the cabin, and Tobias felt his jaw tighten. This wasn't a random group of opportunists anymore. Someone had sent professionals. He had perhaps 2 minutes before they closed the circle completely. Tobias moved to the trapdoor, knocked twice, the signal they'd agreed upon. Augustus's pale face appeared in the opening, understanding the situation instantly. "Stay down," Tobias whispered. "No matter what you hear, stay down and keep Stella quiet, Mr. Hawke," Augustus started. But Tobias was already moving, dropping the heavy rug over the trapdoor, pushing the table across it for good measure. If things went badly, if they got past him, maybe the searchers would miss the cellar. Maybe Augustus and Stella would have a chance. The first bullet came through the window without warning, shattering the glass and burying itself in the far wall. Tobias was already rolling, coming up behind the overturned bed frame he'd positioned earlier for exactly this purpose. Return fire would give away his position, so he waited, counting heartbeats, listening to the sounds of men positioning themselves outside. "Hawke!" A voice called from the darkness, cultured and cold. "We know you've got them. Send out Augustus Vale and the girl, and you can walk away from this. Nobody needs to die tonight." Tobias said nothing, just checked his rifle, made sure his revolver was loose in its holster. Words were wasted now. These men had come for blood or bounty, probably both, and talking wouldn't change their minds. "We're coming in," the voice announced after a moment of silence. "What happens next is on you." They hit the door with a battering ram. Some hastily cut logs swung between 2 men. The door was solid. Tobias had built it to last, but the hinges were starting to give. He aimed carefully, fired through the wood at chest height where the ram carriers would be. The battering stopped, replaced by cursing and the sound of a body hitting the ground. Then all hell broke loose. Muzzle flashes lit up the night as the attackers opened fire from multiple positions, bullets punching through the cabin walls like they were made of paper. Tobias stayed low, moved between positions, returning fire only when he had a clear target. He dropped one man trying to climb through the broken window, wounded another attempting to flank around the side. But there were too many, and they were too organized. The door finally gave way with a splintering crash. Two men rushed through, revolvers blazing, and Tobias met them with rifle fire that dropped the first and sent the second diving for cover behind the overturned table. The table that covered the trap door. Tobias's blood went cold. He couldn't shoot without risking hitting Augustus and Stella below. The attacker realized his advantage, grinned from behind his makeshift barricade, started to rise for a killing shot. Tobias threw his rifle at the man's face, drew his revolver in the same motion, fired 3 times as fast as thought. The attacker went down hard, sliding off the table in a spreading pool of darkness. But the distraction had cost Tobias. He felt the impact before he heard the shot, a hammer blow to his left shoulder that spun him around and dropped him to one knee. Pain exploded through his arm, hot and electric, and his revolver clattered to the floor. Another attacker was coming through the door, rifle raised, and Tobias knew with crystal certainty that he was out of time. The shot that saved his life came from an unexpected direction. The attacker in the doorway jerked, stumbled, fell forward to reveal Augustus Vale standing in the open trapdoor, an old cavalry pistol smoking in his shaking hands. The old man's face was white as bone, but his eyes were steady. "Get down!" Tobias shouted, diving for his fallen revolver. Augustus dropped back into the cellar as more bullets chewed through the cabin walls. Tobias grabbed his gun with his right hand, his left arm hanging useless, and scrambled behind the heavy iron stove that was the only real cover left. The shooting stopped suddenly, replaced by an eerie silence. Tobias could hear his own ragged breathing, could feel blood running hot down his arm and soaking into his shirt. He'd lost count of how many attackers were down, how many were still out there. His vision was starting to blur at the edges, shock trying to drag him under. "Hawk!" That cultured voice again, closer now. "You're bleeding out. I can hear it in your breathing. Let us take the veils and I'll let you live. You have my word as a gentleman." Tobias almost laughed at that, the idea that these killers operated under any code of honor. He gripped his revolver tighter, trying to steady his aim despite the tremor in his hand. "Your word," he called back, his voice rough with pain, "isn't worth the air it takes to speak it." A different sound cut through the night then, one that made Tobias's heart leap with desperate hope. Hoofbeats, multiple horses moving fast, and voices calling out in Choctaw. The cavalry wasn't coming, but something almost as good was, his mother's people, and they were angry. The attackers heard it too. Tobias caught the sound of panicked consultation outside, then running footsteps as the surviving gunmen decided that whatever they were being paid wasn't worth facing a Choctaw war party. Within seconds, the clearing was empty, except for the bodies and the smell of gunpowder. Tobias tried to stand, made it halfway before his legs gave out. The trapdoor flew open, and Augustus was there, stronger than he should be, catching Tobias before he hit the floor. Behind him, Stella's white face appeared, her eyes huge with terror. "Stay in the cellar," Augustus commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. Stella disappeared back down the ladder as the old man eased Tobias onto his back, began tearing away the blood-soaked shirt to examine the wound. "Through and through," Augustus muttered, his hands moving with surprising competence. "Messy, but survivable if we stop the bleeding." The door darkened with new arrivals, and Tobias looked up to see faces he recognized from the settlement, from his mother's clan. Standing Eagle, Grey Fox, young Thomas Sixkiller who couldn't be more than 19. They took in the scene with hard eyes, weapons ready, and Standing Eagle knelt beside Tobias with the casual grace of a warrior. "Brother," Standing Eagle said in Choctaw, using the term that meant more than blood. We heard the shooting from the river camp. Came as fast as we could. Not fast enough, Tobias managed, switching to his mother's tongue, the language that still came easier when he was hurting. But I'm grateful. Who were they? Grey Fox asked, checking the bodies with professional thoroughness. Augustus answered in careful English, understanding enough of the Choctaw to follow the question if not the specific words. Bounty hunters or worse. They're after me and my granddaughter. The Choctaw warriors exchanged glances, silent communication that Tobias was too pain-fogged to read. Standing Eagle's expression hardened. The white man's troubles, he said, still in Choctaw. Always they bring violence to places that were peaceful. He saved us, Tobias said, forcing the words out, despite the pain trying to drag him down. The old man. He could have stayed hidden, but he put himself at risk to save my life. He met Standing Eagle's eyes. That means something. That means he's under our protection now. Standing Eagle studied Augustus for a long moment, taking in the old man's refined features. His expensive clothes now torn and stained with Tobias's blood, the way his hands never stopped working to staunch the wound, even as he met the warrior's gaze, without flinching. You have courage, Standing Eagle said in English. For a white man who should have stayed in his cities, I'm beginning to think you're right, Augustus replied, with a ghost of grim humor. But my granddaughter and I are here now, and it seems our presence has brought danger to your friend, our brother, Grey Fox corrected, coming back from his inspection of the perimeter. And what threatens him threatens the clan. He looked at Standing Eagle. We should move them. More may come when these don't return. Tobias tried to protest, tried to say he could defend his own cabin, but Standing Eagle's hand on his good shoulder stopped him. Listen to wisdom, little brother. You're hurt, your home is destroyed, and there are at least 3 dead white men in your clearing. The law will come, and they won't care about the truth. They'll see dead whites and a Choctaw with a gun. The brutal reality of it cut through Tobias's pain-induced stubbornness. Standing Eagle was right. It didn't matter that he'd been defending himself, that he'd been protecting innocence. What mattered was what a white sheriff would see, and what he'd see was excuse enough for a hanging. Where? Tobias asked, surrendering to necessity. The old camp in the canyon, Standing Eagle said. 3 hours' ride if we go careful. You can heal there out of sight. While we figure out what to do about your guests and their troubles. Augustus had finished bandaging Tobias's shoulder with torn strips of what had probably been an expensive shirt. Now he stood, his face grave. I won't let you risk yourselves further. If you'll guide us to the nearest town with a telegraph office, I can contact my people in San Antonio. They'll send help, and until your help arrives. Grey Fox asked pointedly, what stops the next group of killers? Or the town sheriff who wants to make a name bringing in the Indian who murdered white men? He shook his head. No, you've tangled your fate with Tobias's now. That means you come with us, stay hidden until this storm passes. Before Augustus could argue further, Stella emerged from the cellar, her small face set with determination. She walked straight to Tobias, placed her hand on his uninjured arm with the solemnity of a much older person. You promised, she said quietly. You promised nothing would happen to Grandpa or me. But I promise, too. I promise we won't let anything happen to you. The simple declaration, delivered with such fierce conviction by a child who'd already proven braver than most adults, settled something in the room. Standing Eagle's expression softened fractionally, and even Grey Fox's hard features showed a flicker of approval. The child has honor, Standing Eagle said. Very well. We leave in 10 minutes. Take only what you can carry. The next hour passed in a blur of motion and pain. The Choctaw warriors helped load what supplies could be salvaged onto horses they'd brought from the river camp. Tobias's rifle, his few possessions, some food stores that hadn't been destroyed in the firefight. Augustus moved with surprising efficiency despite his injuries, helping Stella gather her few belongings. The carved figures Tobias had started making for her during the long evenings. The map she'd drawn in the dirt, now carefully copied onto paper. They buried the dead men in a shallow mass grave, not out of respect but necessity. Leaving bodies would draw attention, and attention was the last thing they needed. Thomas Sixkiller said a brief prayer in Choctaw, asking the spirits to guide the dead away from the living, to prevent their angry ghosts from following. By the time they rode out, the first grey light of dawn was touching the eastern horizon. Tobias sat his horse with grim determination, refusing to show how much the movement cost him, how each jolt sent fresh waves of agony through his shoulder. Stella rode with Standing Eagle, the warrior having wordlessly lifted her onto his horse with a gentleness that belied his fierce appearance. Augustus rode beside Grey Fox, the two men maintaining a careful silence that spoke of mutual wariness and grudging respect. The journey to the canyon camp was every bit as difficult as Tobias had feared. They moved through rough country, avoiding trails and main routes, keeping to deer paths and rocky ground that wouldn't hold tracks. Twice they stopped to let Tobias rest, though he protested each time. Augustus used these breaks to check the bandages, to force water and jerky into Tobias, despite his lack of appetite. "You need to maintain your strength," the old man said during the second stop, his voice brooking no argument. "Blood loss weakens the body, makes it vulnerable to infection and fever. I've seen too many men survive the initial wound only to die days later from neglect. You know medicine." Tobias asked, the question coming out slurred with exhaustion. "I know many things," Augustus replied evasively, "including enough to recognize that you're running on stubbornness and pride. That will only carry you so far." They reached the canyon as full morning broke across the land, revealing a hidden place that Tobias had visited only once before, years ago when Standing Eagle had first shown him the old ways. The camp was tucked into a fold in the rock walls, invisible from any angle unless you knew exactly where to look. A spring bubbled up from the canyon floor, feeding a small pool surrounded by cottonwoods. There were rock shelters, caves really, that provided protection from weather and prying eyes. This was a war camp, Standing Eagle explained to Augustus as they dismounted. From the old times, before the whites came in numbers. Our grandfathers used this place when they raided the Comanche, when they defended our hunting grounds." His expression was unreadable. "Now it hides us from the civilization that claims to have tamed this land." They settled Tobias in the largest shelter, laying him on blankets spread over a bed of dried grass. Augustus worked over him with focused intensity, cleaning the wound properly now that they had time and clean water, applying poultices made from plants Grey Fox gathered with expert knowledge. Stella helped without being asked, holding bandages, fetching water, her small hands steady despite the fear Tobias could see in her eyes. "You did well back there," Tobias told her when Augustus stepped away to confer with the warriors. "In the cellar. Staying quiet, staying hidden. That took real courage." "I was scared," Stella admitted, sitting beside him on the cave floor. "I've never been so scared, not even when Mama and Papa died, because then there were doctors and nurses, people who knew what to do." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "But back there I thought everyone was going to die." "But we didn't," Tobias said, catching her hand with his good one. "We survived, all of us, and that's what matters. Because you kept your promise," Stella said, squeezing his fingers. "You said you wouldn't let anything happen to us, and you didn't, even when it meant getting hurt." Tobias wanted to tell her that promises didn't always survive contact with reality, that sometimes people failed despite their best intentions. But looking at her serious young face, at the trust there that was still somehow unshaken despite everything, he found he couldn't speak those cynical truths. So he just nodded, let her believe in promises and protection, let her hold on to whatever comfort she could find. Augustus returned with Standing Eagle, both men wearing expressions of controlled concern. "We need to talk," the old man said quietly, glancing at Stella. "Little one, would you help Thomas with the horses? He could use someone with your good sense." Stella looked between her grandfather and Tobias, clearly wanting to stay, but she nodded obediently and slipped out into the morning light. When she was gone, Augustus settled himself cross-legged on the cave floor, with a grace that suggested his injuries were healing faster than expected. "Those men last night," Augustus began without preamble. "They weren't common bounty hunters. They were too well organized, too well armed. Which means someone with resources wants us found." He paused. "I think it's time I told you the truth about who we are and why we're being hunted." Standing Eagle had positioned himself in the cave entrance, watching the canyon while listening. Now he spoke without turning. "The truth would have been welcome before we risked our lives," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "You're right," Augustus acknowledged, "and I apologize for my deception. But understand, I was protecting my granddaughter from knowledge that could endanger her further." He took a breath. "My name is Augustus Vale. My family owns the Vale Land Company. We hold title to over 200,000 acres of Texas territory, from the Brazos to the Caprock, including mineral rights and water rights. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. The number hit Tobias like a physical blow. 200,000 acres. Half the territory, just as those riders had implied. He'd been sheltering not just wealthy people, but landed gentry on a scale he could barely comprehend. "My son Edward was set to inherit the company," Augustus continued, his voice steady despite the emotion beneath. "But when he and his wife died, everything fell to Stella. She's 9 years old and she owns an empire." His face hardened. "An empire that certain people would very much like to control. So they're trying to kill you," Standing Eagle said, finally turning to face them. "Take the child, force her to sign papers she doesn't understand, or simply eliminate both of us," Augustus said bluntly. "Make it look like an accident. Let the property revert to the state, where it can be sold off to the highest bidders." He met Tobias's eyes. "That's why I couldn't tell you. That's why I let you think we were just travelers. Because everyone who knows the truth becomes either a target or a potential threat." Tobias felt anger flare through his pain and exhaustion. "You let me risk my life without knowing what I was really protecting," he said, his voice rough. "You let these warriors put themselves in danger?" "Yes," Augustus said simply, "and I'd do it again, because any other choice meant watching my granddaughter die." His voice broke slightly. "You want me to apologize for choosing her life over transparency?" "I won't. I can't." The raw honesty of it deflated Tobias's anger. He would have done the same, he realized. In Augustus's position, with a child's life at stake, he would have lied, manipulated, done whatever it took to keep that child safe. Understanding didn't make it right, but it made it human. "So what now?" Grey Fox asked from deeper in the cave, where he'd been listening silently. "These land-hungry whites won't stop. They'll search every settlement, question every traveler. Eventually they'll hear about a Choctaw camp in the canyon." "I can reach my people," Augustus said. "If you can get us to a telegraph office, I can bring in security, lawyers, federal marshals, if necessary. The Vale Company has resources, connections." "How long?" Standing Eagle interrupted. 3 days, perhaps 4, for help to arrive from San Antonio." The warriors exchanged glances, silent consultation in the Choctaw way. Finally Standing Eagle nodded. 4 days we can manage. But after that, you and your troubles need to be gone from this place. Our people have enough problems with the whites without harboring their fugitives." "Fair enough," Augustus said. "And I'll compensate you generously for the risk you're taking." "We don't want your money," Grey Fox said sharply. "We do this for Tobias, because he's clan, because his mother was our sister." He glanced at Tobias. "Even if he did choose to live like a hermit instead of with his people," there was old hurt in those words, old arguments that Tobias was too tired to rehash. "I'll go to town," he said instead, trying to sit up and immediately regretting it as pain lanced through his shoulder. "Send the telegraph." "You're not going anywhere," Augustus said firmly, pushing him back down with surprising strength. "You're injured and recognizable. They'll be watching for you." He looked at Standing Eagle. "But perhaps your young friend Thomas could carry a message. He looks white enough to pass without question." Standing Eagle bristled at that, but Grey Fox nodded slowly. He's not wrong. Thomas has his father's light skin, his mother's straight hair. In white man's clothes with his hair cut short, he trailed off. Clearly not liking the suggestion, but seeing the practicality. They spent the next hour composing the telegraph message, Augustus dictating, while Tobias helped refine the wording to be both urgent and discreet. Standing Eagle produced paper and pencil from somewhere, and Thomas Sixkiller committed the message to memory with the intensity of a warrior preparing for battle. When he rode out an hour later, wearing borrowed clothes and carrying enough coin for the telegraph fee, he looked like any young ranch hand on an errand. Tobias watched him go with a mixture of hope and dread. 4 days until help arrived. 4 days of hiding in a canyon, of waiting for discovery, of wondering if Augustus's people would arrive before the next wave of hunters. 4 days of healing or dying, depending on whether his wound festered or his body proved strong enough to fight off infection. Augustus seemed to read his thoughts. "Rest now," the old man said, adjusting the blankets with careful hands. "I'll keep watch. You've done your part, more than your part. Let others carry the burden for a while." "Not used to that," Tobias muttered, but his eyes were already closing. Exhaustion and blood loss dragging him toward unconscious darkness. "I know," Augustus said softly. "Men like you never are. But perhaps it's time you learned." The last thing Tobias heard before sleep claimed him was the sound of Stella's laughter from somewhere outside the cave. High and clear and impossibly innocent, as if the world wasn't hunting her, as if death hadn't come calling just hours before. And he thought maybe that sound, that refusal to let terror win, was the bravest thing he'd ever witnessed. Fever came for Tobias on the second day, arriving with the sunset like an unwelcome visitor who knew the house too well. He woke from fitful sleep to find his body burning from the inside out, his shoulder a white-hot brand of agony that seemed to pulse in rhythm with his racing heartbeat. Augustus was beside him instantly, cool cloth pressed to his forehead, speaking in low, urgent tones to Grey Fox, who appeared with arms full of fresh plants from the canyon floor. "The wound is infected," Augustus said, his voice tight with controlled worry. "Despite our best efforts, something has taken hold." Tobias tried to speak, to tell them he'd survived worse, but his tongue felt thick and useless in his mouth. The cave walls seemed to breathe around him, expanding and contracting like living lungs, and he couldn't tell if it was real or just the fever playing tricks with his perception. Faces swam in and out of focus, Augustus's lined features blending with Grey Fox's weathered countenance, Standing Eagle's hard eyes watching from somewhere beyond the firelight. "We need to cut it open again," Grey Fox said in Choctaw, the words filtering through Tobias's fever-fogged mind. "Drain the poison, pack it with fresh poultice." "He's too weak," Augustus argued in English, understanding enough of the meaning if not the exact words. "The shock could kill him." "The infection will certainly kill him," Standing Eagle's voice flat and final. "Better a small chance than no chance at all." Tobias wanted to tell them he could hear every word, that he wasn't gone yet, but darkness was pulling at him with insistent hands. He felt himself slipping, felt the world tilting sideways, and then Stella's face appeared above him, her small features set with determination that seemed far too old for her years. "Don't you dare," she whispered fiercely, gripping his good hand with surprising strength. "Don't you dare break your promise, Tobias Hawke. You said you'd keep us safe, and you can't do that if you die." The simple logic of it, the absolute refusal to accept his surrender, cut through the fever haze like a knife. Tobias squeezed her hand back, managed the smallest nod, and saw relief flood her face. Then Augustus was there with a leather strap, placing it between Tobias's teeth, and he understood what was coming. The pain, when they reopened the wound, was unlike anything he'd experienced. A living thing that consumed thought and breath and will. He bit down on the leather until he tasted blood, felt strong hands holding him down as Grey Fox worked with brutal efficiency. The world went white, then red, then mercifully black. When consciousness returned, it came slowly, like swimming up from deep water. Tobias became aware of sensations one at a time. The cool press of stone beneath him, the crackle of fire somewhere close, voices speaking in low tones that gradually resolved into words he could understand. "The fever's broken," Augustus was saying, relief evident in every syllable. "Whatever poison was in there, you got it out." "The old ways," Grey Fox replied with quiet pride. "White medicine has its place, but sometimes the plants know better." Tobias opened his eyes to find the cave bathed in afternoon light, golden and warm. He'd lost time, hours or maybe days, he couldn't tell. His shoulder still hurt, but it was a clean pain now, honest and bearable rather than the sick burning of infection. He tried to sit up, made it halfway before Augustus's hand stopped him. "Slowly," the old man cautioned. "You've been unconscious for a day and a half. Your body needs time to remember how to work." "Water," Tobias managed, his voice coming out as a croak. Stella appeared with a canteen, helping him drink with the careful attention of someone who'd been watching and learning. The water was cold and sweet, drawn from the canyon spring, and Tobias drank deeply before his protesting stomach forced him to stop. "Thomas returned this morning," Standing Eagle said, moving into Tobias's field of vision. "Your message was sent. Help is coming. How long?" Tobias asked. 2 more days, Augustus replied. "They're sending a security detail from San Antonio, 20 armed men with a federal marshal. The territorial governor himself has taken an interest." He paused. "It seems the Vale name still carries weight, even out here in the wilderness." Tobias closed his eyes, processing this information. 2 more days of hiding, 2 more days of vulnerability. It felt like an eternity and no time at all. "The hunters," he said. "They'll be searching." "Let them search," Grey Fox said with grim satisfaction. "This canyon has hidden our people for generations. A few white men with guns won't find what they're not meant to find." But even as he spoke, young Thomas Sixkiller appeared at the cave entrance, his face flushed with exertion and alarm. "Riders," he said in Choctaw. 6 of them, maybe more. They're questioning people in the settlement, showing a drawing of the old man and the girl. The temperature in the cave seemed to drop despite the fire. Augustus's face went pale, and Stella moved closer to her grandfather instinctively, seeking the protection of his presence. Standing Eagle and Grey Fox exchanged glances, years of partnership allowing them to communicate without words. "How close?" Standing Eagle asked. 5 miles, maybe 6, Thomas replied. They spoke to old Mary Goodwater, asked if she'd seen strangers. She told them nothing, but they're working their way through every family, every camp. "They'll find us eventually," Augustus said quietly, stating the obvious truth. "Even if your people stay silent, someone will talk, or they'll find tracks, or simply stumble across this place." He stood, his movements still careful, but stronger than they'd been days ago. "We should leave, draw them away from here before they discover the camp." "You'd never make it," Grey Fox said flatly. "The old man is barely healed, the girl is a child, and Tobias can't ride hard for days. They'd run you down in hours." "Then we make a stand," Stella said, her young voice cutting through the adult conversation with unexpected authority. "We defended the cabin. We can defend the canyon." "With what?" Standing Eagle asked, not unkindly. "We have rifles but limited ammunition. They'll have numbers, fresh horses, no wounded to slow them down." He shook his head. "Fighting is the last choice, not the first." Tobias forced himself to sit up fully, ignoring the protests from his shoulder. His mind was working again, the fever fog lifting enough to let him think strategically. "We don't fight," he said slowly, an idea taking shape. "We mislead, make them think we've already left the area." "How?" Augustus leaned forward, interested. "Thomas," Tobias looked at the young warrior. "You said they're showing drawings, asking questions. That means they don't know for certain we're here. They're just searching every possible location." He turned to Standing Eagle. "What if they found evidence we'd moved on? Tracks leading south toward the border. Signs of a camp abandoned in haste." Standing Eagle's eyes narrowed, considering. "False trails. It could work, but it would need to be convincing. Real supplies left behind, tracks from the right number of horses, and someone to spot it," Grey Fox added, catching onto the plan. Someone who accidentally let slip to these hunters that they saw strangers matching the description heading south 2 days ago. Old Mary could do it, Thomas suggested. She's clever enough to make it seem reluctant. Like she's trying to protect us, but can't resist the money they're offering. The plan took shape quickly after that, each person contributing details, refining the deception until it felt solid enough to work. They would create a false campsite 5 miles south, scatter it with supplies that could believably belong to fleeing fugitives, lay tracks that showed 3 riders and a child heading toward the Mexican border. Meanwhile, old Mary Goodwater would reluctantly confirm to the hunters that yes, she'd seen such people. They'd bought supplies 3 days ago and mentioned something about crossing the Rio Grande. "It's risky," Augustus said when the details were settled. "If they see through it, then we're no worse off than we are now," Tobias interrupted. "But if it works, we buy 2 more days. 2 days for your security detail to arrive, for the federal marshal to establish authority." He met the old man's eyes. "Sometimes the best defense is making your enemy chase shadows." They put the plan into motion immediately, knowing that time was their enemy as much as the hunters. Grey Fox and Thomas rode out to create the false camp, carrying supplies carefully chosen to look valuable but not suspicious in their absence. Standing Eagle went to speak with Mary Goodwater to prepare her for the performance she'd need to give. That left Tobias, Augustus, and Stella alone in the canyon camp, waiting with the particular tension that comes from knowing your fate rests in other people's hands. "Tell me about San Antonio," Tobias said after a long silence, partly to distract Stella, who was watching the canyon entrance with worried eyes. Partly because he realized how little he actually knew about the people he'd risked everything to protect. Augustus settled himself more comfortably against the cave wall, his expression softening at the change of subject. "San Antonio is beautiful," he said. "Old Spanish missions, newer buildings rising up alongside them, a city caught between its past and its future." He glanced at Stella. "We have a house there, don't we, little one? A proper house with a garden." "And a library," Stella added, some of the tension leaving her shoulders as she thought about home. "Papa built me a library with shelves that go all the way to the ceiling. I had to use a ladder to reach the top books." Tobias caught the past tense. Stella's face fell. "I don't know if it's still there. Grandpa said we might have to sell the house, that the company needs money, and houses are just buildings." "The company needs restructuring," Augustus corrected gently. "And yes, we may need to liquidate some assets. But your father's library will be protected, I promise you that." He turned to Tobias. "Edward built that library himself, spent months designing it, choosing every book. It was his gift to Stella, his way of ensuring she'd have all the knowledge the world could offer." There was grief in his voice, the particular pain of surviving your own children. Tobias recognized it because he'd seen it before, in the settlement after disease swept through, in the eyes of parents who'd outlived their sons and daughters. "He sounds like he was a good man," Tobias said. "The best," Augustus replied simply. "Smart, principled, devoted to his family. Everything a father could hope for in a son." His voice thickened. "And I failed him. I was in Boston managing the Eastern properties, while he and Margaret were dying in St. Louis. By the time I received word and made the journey, they were already gone." "You couldn't have known," Tobias said. "Couldn't I?" Augustus's eyes were haunted. "I chose business over family, chose expansion over presence. I told myself I was building an empire for Edward to inherit. But what good is an empire to a dead man?" He looked at Stella, who'd moved to sit beside him. "So now I'm trying to do better, to be present for his daughter in ways I wasn't always present for him." "You're doing your best," Stella said, taking her grandfather's hand. "That's what Mama always said matters. Not being perfect, but trying your best." The simple wisdom from such a young person seemed to steady Augustus. He pulled Stella close, kissed the top of her head, and for a moment they were just a grandfather and granddaughter, not fugitives hiding in a canyon. Just family, holding on to each other, because that's what you did when the world tried to tear you apart. Tobias looked away, giving them privacy, and found himself thinking about his own family. His mother, dead 20 years now. His father, drunk and angry, until the drink finally killed him. His sister moved to Oklahoma Territory with her husband, writing letters Tobias rarely answered. He'd cut himself off from all of it, convinced that isolation was strength. Before he could sink deeper into those dark thoughts, the sound of returning horses echoed through the canyon. All three of them tensed, hands moving toward weapons, until Standing Eagle's voice called out the all-clear in Choctaw. He rode in alone, his face carefully neutral. Mary performed beautifully, Standing Eagle reported, dismounting. The hunters arrived just as we'd hoped, questioned her aggressively. She told them exactly what we planned, even cried a little, said she felt terrible betraying strangers who'd been kind to her, but needed the reward money. A slight smile crossed his face. They believed every word. 6 riders left an hour ago, heading south at speed. The relief in the cave was palpable. Stella actually laughed, a sound of pure joy that echoed off the stone walls. Augustus closed his eyes, breathing deeply, and Tobias felt tension he hadn't realized he was carrying flow out of his shoulders. How long before they realized the deception? Tobias asked. A day, perhaps 2 if we're fortunate, Standing Eagle said. The false camp is convincing, but experienced trackers will eventually notice inconsistencies. When they do, they'll turn back angry. But by then the security detail will have arrived, Augustus said. Federal authority, legal documentation, enough firepower to make these hunters think twice. He stood, extended his hand to Standing Eagle. Thank you. For everything, Standing Eagle looked at the offered hand before taking it, the handshake brief but genuine. Tobias's clan, he said simply. What threatens him threatens us. He fixed Augustus with a hard stare. But when your people arrive and this trouble is resolved, you take your wealth and your problems and you go. Understood, Augustus said. Once we're safe, we'll leave this territory. Something twisted in Tobias's chest at those words. Of course they would leave. They had a whole life waiting in San Antonio, a company to run, a house with a library. What was there to keep them here? Tobias could come with us, Stella said suddenly. To San Antonio. We have room, and Grandpa always says good men are hard to find. Stella, Augustus said gently, but the girl pressed on. Why not? He saved us. He protected us. She turned to Tobias, her dark eyes pleading. Don't you want to come? Don't you want to see the library and the missions? Tobias found he couldn't look at her directly. I appreciate the offer, he said carefully. But this is my home. I don't belong in cities. You don't know that, Stella argued. That's enough, little one, Augustus said firmly. Mr. Hawke has his own life, his own choices. He met Tobias's eyes over Stella's head, and there was understanding there, and something that might have been hope. That night, unable to sleep, Tobias found Augustus sitting outside the cave, staring up at the stars. The old man didn't speak when Tobias settled beside him, just shifted to make room. Stella has her grandmother's eyes, Augustus said after a long silence. The same way of seeing through people, of finding the truth beneath what they show. He glanced at Tobias. She sees you clearly, I think. Sees the man who keeps his promises, who stands between the innocent and danger. He paused. Who's been alone long enough? You don't know me well enough to say that, Tobias protested. Don't I? Augustus challenged gently. You're competent, self-sufficient, capable, but you're also profoundly lonely, and you've convinced yourself that loneliness is strength. Tobias wanted to argue, to deny, but the fever had left him raw. What if you're right? He said quietly. What difference does it make? He'll be gone in 2 days. The offer Stella made wasn't entirely impulsive, Augustus said. The Veil Company needs good men, honest men who understand this territory. He paused. I'm offering you a position. Head of Western Security Operations. It would mean relocating to San Antonio. The offer hung in the night air, impossible and tempting. Why? Tobias asked. Because my granddaughter already loves you like family, Augustus said. Because I've seen your character tested and found it solid. Because I want someone who understands that some things matter more than profit, he turned to Tobias. And because you deserve a chance to discover who you might be if you stopped hiding. Tobias had no answer, no argument that didn't sound like fear. So he sat in the darkness, thinking about libraries and gardens and promises, wondering if maybe it was time to stop running. Dawn broke clear and cold over the canyon, the kind of morning that made promises feel possible. Tobias woke to find his shoulder pain diminished to a dull ache, manageable now rather than consuming, and he took it as a sign that his body was finally remembering how to heal. He emerged from the cave to find the camp already stirring. Grey Fox tending a small fire, Thomas checking the horses, and Stella sitting on a flat rock with a stick, drawing patterns in the dirt with the focused concentration he'd come to recognize as her way of processing worry. They should arrive today, Augustus said, appearing beside Tobias with 2 cups of coffee, the real kind they'd been saving for special occasions. The security detail from San Antonio. I sent word of this canyon's location in the telegraph. By noon, perhaps early afternoon, Tobias accepted the coffee gratefully, savoring the bitter warmth. And then what? You ride out with 20 armed men, and I go back to what's left of my cabin. Is that what you want? Augustus asked, his tone carefully neutral. Before Tobias could answer, Standing Eagle called out from his position at the canyon entrance, his voice carrying urgency without panic. Riders coming, 4 of them, moving fast from the north. Every warrior in camp reached for weapons instantly, years of frontier living turning caution into reflex. Tobias grabbed his rifle despite the protest from his shoulder, positioned himself where he could see the approach while maintaining cover. Augustus pulled Stella behind the largest boulder, his old cavalry pistol drawn and ready, but the riders who appeared weren't the hunters they'd been expecting. These were different men entirely, dressed in professional clothes that had seen hard travel, riding expensive horses that spoke of resources and organization. The lead rider was a tall man with iron-gray hair and a marshal's badge pinned to his vest, his posture radiating authority that had nothing to do with the rifle across his saddle. "Augustus Vale," the marshal called out, his voice carrying across the canyon. "I'm Federal Marshal James Kincaid, sent by Governor Thornton. We received your telegraph. Is everyone all right?" The tension broke like a snapped wire. Augustus stepped out from cover, relief washing over his features so profoundly that he seemed to age backwards, 10 years in an instant. "Marshal Kincaid, thank God. Yes, we're safe. Thanks to these men." He gestured to the Choctaw warriors and Tobias. "They've protected us at great personal cost." Marshal Kincaid dismounted, his 3 companions spreading out with the practiced ease of men who knew their business. The marshal was older than Tobias had initially thought, probably past 60, but he moved with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent a lifetime in the saddle. His eyes, sharp and assessing, took in the canyon camp, the makeshift shelter, the bandages visible on Tobias's shoulder. "We passed 6 men on the South Road yesterday," Kincaid said, his gaze settling on Augustus. "They had the look of hired guns, moving fast like they were chasing something. When we asked their business, they said they were hunting bandits who'd robbed a wagon train. They're the hunters we've been evading," Augustus confirmed. "Men sent by parties who wished to gain control of my granddaughter's inheritance. They attacked Mr. Hawk's cabin 3 nights ago." He gestured to the bodies they'd buried near the canyon entrance. 3 of their number are in that grave." Kincaid's expression hardened. "Self-defense, I assume. Clear as daylight," Standing Eagle said, stepping forward. "They came in the night, shot first, would have murdered everyone if not for Tobias and the old man's courage." The marshal studied Standing Eagle for a long moment, taking in the warrior's bearing, the quiet authority in his stance. "You're Choctaw," he observed. "I am," Standing Eagle replied, his voice neutral but his eyes watchful. "Then you have my thanks," Kincaid said, surprising everyone. The governor's orders were explicit: protect Augustus Vale and his granddaughter at all costs. If the Choctaw hadn't sheltered them, hadn't held off those hunters— He shook his head. "The territory owes you a debt." Standing Eagle's expression remained carefully controlled, but Tobias caught the flicker of surprise in his eyes. Federal marshals acknowledging debts to Indians wasn't common practice, and the open respect in Kincaid's voice was rarer still. "The main security detail is half a day behind us," Kincaid continued, turning back to Augustus. 20 men, 3 wagons with supplies, and enough legal documentation to bury your enemies in paperwork for the next decade. A slight smile crossed his weathered face. "The governor took your situation very seriously, Mr. Vale. When one of the territory's wealthiest landowners reports an assassination attempt, wheels turn quickly." "I'm grateful," Augustus said. "Though I confess I'm surprised by the speed of the response." "Don't be," Kincaid replied. "The Vale Land Company owns a significant portion of this territory. If word spread that wealthy investors could be murdered with impunity, every land speculator and opportunist would descend like locusts." He pulled a folded document from his coat. "The governor has issued a territorial warrant for the arrest of anyone involved in the attacks on you. Additionally, he's assigned a permanent security detail to your properties until this matter is resolved." Stella had emerged from behind the boulder, her small hand gripping her grandfather's coat. She studied the marshal with those serious dark eyes, seeming to assess whether this new authority figure could be trusted. Kincaid noticed her attention and crouched down to bring himself to her eye level, a gesture of respect that clearly surprised her. "You must be Miss Stella Vale," he said gently. "I've heard you've been very brave through all this." "I had help," Stella said, glancing at Tobias. "Tobias Hawke saved us from the river and from the men who came to his cabin. He got shot protecting us." Kincaid stood, his eyes finding Tobias with new interest. "A Hawke," he repeated. "Any relation to Daniel Hawke, who used to scout for the army out of Fort Worth?" "My father," Tobias confirmed, surprised the marshal knew the name. "I served with him briefly, back in '58, Kincaid said. "Before the war. He was the best tracker I ever saw, could read ground like other men read newspapers." His expression sobered. "Heard he'd fallen on hard times after his Choctaw wife passed. Lost himself in drink." "He did," Tobias said, his voice flat. "Died of it 10 years ago." "I'm sorry," Kincaid said, and seemed to mean it. "He was a good man before the grief took him." He gestured to Tobias's shoulder. "That wound needs proper medical attention. The security detail has a doctor with them, trained in Philadelphia. He'll want to examine it when they arrive." The morning passed in a strange mixture of relief and lingering tension. The immediate danger had passed with Kincaid's arrival, but everyone understood that the hunters were still out there, still hunting, still dangerous despite the federal warrant. Kincaid's men took up defensive positions around the canyon while they waited for the main security detail. Their professional competence a stark contrast to the desperate improvisation of the past days. Grey Fox and Thomas began breaking down the camp, preparing for departure with the quiet efficiency of men who'd done this many times. Standing Eagle spoke with Kincaid in low tones, sharing information about the hunters' movements, their numbers, their likely routes of approach. Augustus sat with Stella, explaining in careful terms what would happen next. The journey to San Antonio, the legal proceedings that would secure her inheritance. Tobias found himself oddly apart from it all, watching these preparations for a future that didn't include him. He'd done what he set out to do, kept his promise, protected them until proper help arrived. Now the machinery of civilization was engaging. Lawyers and marshals and security details, the kind of organized response that had no place for a half-blood hermit who preferred solitude to society. "You're thinking too loud again," Augustus said, settling beside him on the flat rock where Stella had been drawing earlier. "I can practically hear the gears grinding, just wondering where I fit in all this," Tobias admitted. "You've got federal protection now, professional security. You don't need a wounded tracker anymore. Is that what you think you are to us?" Augustus asked quietly. "Just a tracker who happened to be convenient." Tobias didn't answer, because he wasn't sure what else he could be. The gap between his world and theirs felt impossibly wide. A chasm measured in wealth and education and social position that no amount of good intentions could bridge. "My offer from last night stands," Augustus said after a moment. "Head of Western Security Operations for the Vale Land Company. It's not charity and it's not gratitude, though God knows we owe you both." He turned to face Tobias directly. "It's recognition of capability. You kept us alive through situations that would have killed most men. You read threats, made hard decisions, stood your ground when running would have been easier." He paused. "Those are exactly the skills I need in someone managing security across 200,000 acres of frontier territory." "I don't know anything about managing operations," Tobias protested. "You know about this land, about the people who live here. Both white and native," Augustus countered. "You understand violence and how to prevent it, or when prevention fails, how to survive it." His voice softened. "And perhaps most importantly, my granddaughter trusts you absolutely. In a world where everyone wants something from her, where her wealth makes her a target, that trust is invaluable." Before Tobias could respond, the sound of approaching horses echoed through the canyon, many horses moving in organized formation. The main security detail had arrived, 20 armed men riding in military precision, followed by 3 heavily loaded wagons. At their head rode a man in his 40s, square-jawed and professional, who dismounted and approached Marshal Kincaid with a crisp salute. "Captain Marcus Webb reporting, sir. 20 men, full supplies, and Dr. Harrison as requested." A thin man with spectacles and a medical bag climbed down from one of the wagons, already scanning the camp with a physician's assessing eye. When his gaze landed on Tobias's bandaged shoulder, he moved toward him with purposeful strides. "That wound needs examination," Dr. Harrison said without preamble. "How long since you were shot?" 3 days, Tobias replied. "And you're still upright and conscious, which suggests either remarkable constitution or adequate field medicine," the doctor said, already unwrapping the bandages Grey Fox had applied. "Let's see what we're working with." The examination was thorough and not particularly gentle, the doctor probing the wound with professional detachment, while Tobias gritted his teeth and endured. Grey Fox watched with interest, comparing the white man's techniques with his own traditional methods, occasionally nodding approval when Dr. Harrison did something that aligned with Choctaw practice. "Clean wound through and through, no bone damage," Harrison finally announced. "Whoever treated this initially did excellent work." He glanced at Grey Fox. "You're doing—" "The plants know their business," Grey Fox said simply. "Indeed they do," Harrison agreed, surprising the warrior with his respect. "I'll apply fresh dressings and leave you with supplies and instructions. With proper care, you should heal completely within 2 weeks." As the doctor worked, the security detail transformed the canyon camp into something resembling a small fortress. Perimeter guards were posted, supplies were organized, and a command tent was erected near the cave entrance. Captain Webb conferred with Marshal Kincaid, reviewing maps and discussing routes back to San Antonio that would maximize safety while minimizing exposure. "We'll depart at first light tomorrow," Webb announced to the assembled group. 3 wagons for supplies and the family, 20 mounted guards in formation. With Marshal Kincaid and his deputies riding advance scout, his eyes found Standing Eagle. "If the Choctaw are willing, we'd appreciate an additional scout familiar with this territory." Standing Eagle exchanged glances with Grey Fox and Thomas before responding. "We'll guide you as far as the territorial border," he said. "Beyond that, you're on your own." "Fair enough," Webb said. "We're grateful for any assistance." The afternoon passed in final preparations, the professional security team moving with practiced efficiency that made everything feel suddenly real. This was ending, Tobias realized. The desperate improvisation, the hiding in canyons, the waiting for death or rescue, all of it was coming to a close. By tomorrow night, Augustus and Stella would be safely back in San Antonio, surrounded by lawyers and guards and the insulating layers of wealth, and Tobias would be where? Back at his destroyed cabin, rebuilding alone? Returning to the Choctaw settlement he'd left 4 years ago? Or taking the impossible offer Augustus kept making? Stepping into a life so foreign to everything he'd known that he couldn't even properly imagine it. "I need an answer," Augustus said that evening, finding Tobias at the canyon edge, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of fire. "The captain wants to know how many people are traveling to San Antonio, and I told him I wasn't certain." He settled beside Tobias, his movements still careful, but much stronger than they'd been days ago. "So I'm asking directly, will you come with us?" Tobias watched the sun sink lower, painting the land in colors that wouldn't last, beautiful precisely because they were temporary. "I'm afraid," he said finally, the admission costing him more than he'd expected. "Of what?" Augustus asked gently. "Of not being enough," Tobias said. "Of stepping into your world and discovering I don't belong there any more than I belonged in the settlement or in my father's world." He turned to face Augustus. "Of caring about people again and having them leave." "Ah," Augustus said, understanding flooding his expression. "You're afraid of being left? Of investing yourself in connection and then being abandoned?" "My mother died," Tobias said, the words coming out harsh. "My father drowned his grief in whiskey until it killed him. The woman I loved married someone else. Everyone I've ever cared about has either died or left, so I stopped caring, stopped investing. Stopped," he broke off, surprised by his own honesty. "Stopped living," Augustus finished softly. "I understand that impulse more than you know. After my wife died, after my son died, I wanted nothing more than to wall myself off, to protect what was left of my heart from further damage." He looked toward the camp where Stella was helping Dr. Harrison organize medical supplies. "But that child needs me, needs more than just my protection. She needs me to model how to survive loss without becoming less than human." His voice strengthened. "So I'm choosing to live, choosing to connect, choosing to risk being hurt again, because the alternative is a kind of death." "And if I come to San Antonio and fail?" Tobias asked. "If I can't do the job, can't adjust to city life, can't be what you need, then we'll figure something else out," Augustus said simply. "But you won't know unless you try." And Tobias, he waited until Tobias met his eyes. "Stella has already lost her parents. If you reject this offer, if you choose isolation over connection, you'll be teaching her that love isn't worth the risk. Is that really the lesson you want her to learn?" The argument was unfair and completely effective. Tobias thought about Stella's fierce declaration in the cabin, her absolute trust that he would keep his promises. He thought about her excitement showing him her map, her eagerness to learn tracking, the way she'd gripped his hand and refused to let him give up when fever tried to claim him. He thought about the library her father had built, about gardens and missions, and the possibility of becoming someone new. "I'll come," he said, the words feeling both terrifying and right. "For 6 months. A trial period. If it doesn't work, if I can't adjust, then we'll revisit the arrangement," Augustus agreed quickly, relief evident in his face. 6 months to see if this life fits you." He extended his hand. "Deal?" Tobias gripped the offered hand, felt the strength in Augustus's grasp despite his age, felt the weight of commitment settling on his shoulders like a familiar coat. "Deal," he confirmed. That night, they held what Standing Eagle called a farewell feast, though the food was simple trail rations dressed up as best they could manage. The Choctaw warriors, the security detail, Augustus and Stella, Marshal Kincaid and his deputies, all gathered around the fire sharing stories and salt pork and the last of the coffee. It was an unlikely assembly, whites and Indians, soldiers and civilians, brought together by circumstance and held together by mutual respect, earned through shared danger. Stella sat between Tobias and her grandfather, her eyes heavy with exhaustion but refusing to sleep, as if she feared missing something important. When Thomas Sixkiller began singing a Choctaw traveling song, his young voice pure and strong, she leaned against Tobias's good shoulder and whispered, "Are you really coming with us?" "I am," Tobias confirmed. "Promise." The word carried weight, an echo of all the promises he'd made and kept over the past days. "Promise," Tobias said, and felt her relax against him, trusting absolutely in his word. As the fire burned down and people began drifting toward their bedrolls, Tobias found himself standing with Standing Eagle at the canyon edge, looking out at the vast darkness of the territory stretching away to forever. The warrior was quiet for a long time before speaking. "You're leaving us," Standing Eagle said, not quite a question. "For a while," Tobias replied. "Maybe permanently." "I'm not sure yet. The white man's world will change you," Standing Eagle warned. "It changes everyone who enters it. You may find that when you return, you no longer fit here either." "Maybe," Tobias acknowledged. "But maybe fitting in one place or the other isn't the point. Maybe the point is finding where you're needed." Standing Eagle considered this, then nodded slowly. "Your mother would be proud," he said. "Not of the choice necessarily, but of the courage to make it." He placed a hand on Tobias's good shoulder, a gesture of brotherhood. "Go with our blessing, little brother, and know that if the white man's world proves false, you always have a place among your mother's people." The words, unexpected and generous, tightened something in Tobias's throat. He'd spent 4 years assuming the settlement had no place for him, that his choice to leave had burned that bridge permanently. To learn otherwise, to know that return was possible, felt like a gift he hadn't known he needed. "Thank you," Tobias managed. "Thank us by living well," Standing Eagle replied. "By honoring your mother's memory through your actions," he smiled slightly. "And by remembering that wealth and position mean nothing if they cost you your soul." As Tobias finally lay down to sleep that night, his shoulder aching but bearable, his future suddenly transformed from solitary certainty to terrifying possibility. He thought about souls and choices, and the courage it took to step into the unknown. Tomorrow they would ride out, leave this canyon that had sheltered them, return to civilization with all its complications and demands. He would become someone new, or try to, and the trying itself felt like the bravest thing he'd ever done. 6 months later, Tobias Hawke stood on the balcony of the Vale Mansion in San Antonio, watching the sun rise over a city that still felt foreign, despite half a year of residence. The Spanish missions caught the early light like promises written in stone, and somewhere in the distance, church bells marked the hour with bronze voices. Behind him, he could hear the household stirring, Augustus's voice calling instructions about the day's meetings. It had been the strangest 6 months of his life. The journey from the canyon to San Antonio had taken 8 days, moving slowly to accommodate Augustus's injuries. They'd arrived without incident, and Tobias's education in civilization had begun immediately. The Vale Mansion was larger than any building he'd ever entered. 3 stories of elegance, surrounded by impossible gardens. His first night, he'd slept on the floor of his assigned bedroom, unable to trust the softness of the bed. Learning his new role had been equally disorienting. The Vale Land Company owned ranches, mining operations, and timber holdings scattered across 200,000 acres. Each operation needed protection from bandits and rustlers. Coordinating that protection required skills Tobias had never developed, but Captain Webb had patiently taught him logistics and planning until the chaos made sense. "You're up early," Augustus said, emerging with 2 cups of coffee, their morning ritual. "Couldn't sleep?" "Old habits," Tobias replied. "Out in the wilderness you learn to wake with first light." They stood in comfortable silence, watching San Antonio come alive. This had become Tobias's favorite time of day, these quiet moments before responsibility intruded. "The Houston office wants to expand into Brazos territory," Augustus said. "They're requesting security assessments before proceeding." "I'll need to ride out there," Tobias said. "Survey the sites, understand the threats. Probably 2 weeks. Mr. Hawke?" Maria's voice from the doorway. "Miss Stella is asking for you. She says it's very important." Tobias found Stella in the library, surrounded by papers and books, her face set with concentration. She'd grown in 6 months, not just physically but in confidence, tutors and stability helping her blossom. "You wanted to see me?" Tobias asked. "I need your opinion on something important," Stella said, gesturing to papers on her desk. "Grandfather has been teaching me about the company. Look at this. The Northern Ranch shows consistent losses, but the manager keeps requesting more funding." Tobias studied the numbers. "What do you think it means?" "I think someone is stealing from us," Stella said bluntly. "The losses are too consistent." Her eyes found his. "I was hoping you could investigate quietly." "I can do that," Tobias agreed. Stella's face fell slightly. "Will you be gone long?" 2 weeks, maybe 3. "That's not so long," she said, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "And you'll write?" "I'll write," Tobias promised, understanding what she wasn't saying. In 6 months, he'd become something between older brother and uncle, a constant presence. His absences worried her more than she admitted. "Everyone promises they'll come back," she said quietly. "Mama and Papa promised they'd get better." Her eyes filled with tears. "Promises don't always survive the world." "You're right," Tobias admitted. "But I can promise I'll do everything in my power to keep coming back." Stella nodded, accepting the honesty. "Then I'll pray the world keeps its plans to itself," she said. The weeks in Brazos territory confirmed Stella's suspicions. The ranch manager was running a systematic theft operation with a local rustling gang. Tobias and Webb gathered evidence for 3 weeks, working undercover. When they returned to San Antonio, they had proof enough to prosecute everyone involved. Augustus's swift legal action sent a clear message across the territory. Veiled properties were no longer easy targets. "You've proven yourself 10 times over," Augustus said one evening in his study. "The board wants to make your position permanent. 5-year contract with substantial compensation." Tobias was surprised by how the news affected him. 6 months ago, he'd been a hermit in a destroyed cabin. Now he was being offered meaningful work and connection to people who'd become family. "I'd need to keep some independence," he said carefully. "Already stipulated," Augustus assured him. "The board trusts your judgment." He paused. "As do I. More importantly, Stella trusts you absolutely." "I'll sign," Tobias said. "Good," Augustus said, "because I have another proposal." He refilled their glasses. "I'm getting old, Tobias. When I die, Stella will need someone she can trust absolutely. I'm asking you to be family. Someone who loves her for herself, not her inheritance." The trust implicit in the offer made Tobias's throat tight. "I'm not educated. I'm a half-blood tracker who barely knows which fork to use. And you're the man who pulled her from a Gator river." Augustus interrupted. "Who took a bullet defending her?" "Character is born in fire, and yours has been tested." A knock interrupted them. Marshal Kincaid entered looking grim. "We have a problem. 3 of the men you prosecuted escaped custody. They've sworn vengeance, and they're heading this way with reinforcements." "How long?" Augustus asked. 2 days, maybe 3, Kincaid said. "They spent hours planning, turning the mansion into a strong point. Captain Webb organized defenses while staff were evacuated." Stella, informed of the threat, asked simply, "What can I do to help?" "Stay safe with your grandfather," Tobias said. "And trust us." "That's what you said in the canyon," Stella observed. "But last time you got shot, despite the tension," Tobias smiled. "I'll do my best," he promised. The attack came on the 3rd night. 15 men hit from 3 sides simultaneously, but Tobias had anticipated the strategy. The fight was brief, but brutal. Tobias intercepted 2 attackers who breached the interior, his revolver and knife doing desperate work. He took a knife across his ribs before the silence finally fell. 7 attackers were dead, 5 captured, 3 fled. Dr. Harrison declared Tobias's wounds dramatic but not dangerous. Augustus emerged with Stella, who took one look at bloody Tobias and burst into tears for the first time since her parents' death. "You promised," she sobbed. "You promised you'd keep coming back and you're bleeding." "But I didn't die," Tobias said, kneeling to meet her eyes. "I'm here. I'm alive. And I'll keep coming back as many times as it takes for you to believe it." 5 years minimum, Augustus said. "He just signed a contract." 5 years isn't forever, Stella said, but she was calming down. In the following weeks, as wounds healed and the mansion was repaired, Tobias found himself settling into his new life. The city still felt foreign sometimes, but protecting people who mattered, building something meaningful, felt more right than anything he'd done in years. One morning, Tobias stood on the balcony watching another sunrise and realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd thought about his old cabin, about the solitary life he'd left behind. He hadn't lost himself in this new world. He'd found a version that included other people, that accepted connection as strength, thinking loud thoughts again. Augustus asked, joining him with coffee. "Just realizing I'm happy," Tobias admitted. "It's been so long I almost didn't recognize the feeling." "It looks good on you," Augustus said. "Stella remarked you smile now. She said when we first met, your face looked like it had forgotten how." They watched the city wake. And Tobias thought about rivers and promises, about the strange paths life took when you were brave enough to follow them. He'd pulled 2 strangers from death in a Gator river, never knowing they owned half the territory. But the real discovery hadn't been their wealth. It had been learning that isolation wasn't safety, that connection was worth the risk. "The board wants to discuss New Mexico expansion," Augustus said. "They're requesting your security assessment." "I'll need to ride out there," Tobias said. "Take Stella with you," Augustus suggested. "She should start seeing the properties she'll manage. Understanding the land, meeting the people. You trust me with that?" Tobias asked. "I trust you with everything that matters," Augustus said simply. "You've proven yourself worthy 100 times over." He smiled. "Besides, she's been reading survey reports for weeks. She knows more about New Mexico's mineral potential than I do." Tobias laughed, imagining Stella lecturing him about silver deposits while he taught her tracking. The image felt right, felt like family. Not by blood or law, but by choice and shared danger survived. 5 years, Augustus said quietly. "Then we'll renegotiate. But Tobias, I hope you know this isn't just about contracts. Your family. Whatever happens, you have a home here." The word settled something in Tobias that had been unsettled since his mother's death. He had a home. Not a cabin where he hid from connection, but a place with people who valued him, who'd become the family he'd convinced himself he didn't want. "Thank you," Tobias said, and meant it with everything he had. Later that morning, as Stella showed him maps with enthusiasm, as she discovered her life's purpose, Tobias thought about the terrified child clinging to wreckage, about the old man who'd seen past his defenses, and about how saving their lives had somehow saved his own. The debt, he realized, ran both ways. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.